Okay. Hello, everybody. I'm not speaking with a PowerPoint today, but I might put up a couple of web pages for us to look at. We'll see how it goes. I don't want to get too involved in technical stuff. Anyone who's had a look at the bits of paper will realise that I haven't produced a paper, but just some notes to speak from. I only spoke to Clem 2 weeks before the conference and didn't really have time to put anything together. So I'm kind of making this up on the hoof a little bit and trying to understand how the work that we do can resonate with the Shared Societies project. And I think when he invited me here, he felt that I might be slightly fazed by being surrounded by policy experts and technocrats, because in a way, where we operate is almost in a parallel universe that doesn't necessarily engage on a policy level in the same way, for reasons that we probably haven't got time to go into today. However, what I'm here to explain is how there is a very recognisable social movement out there that is beginning to use market interventions by, let's call it consumers, as a way of seeking some of the same goals that the Shared Societies project has. This fantastic book that we have, Shared Societies, explain how we have a list of policy demands and we make change by identifying how we need more equality, and policy works from the top by people who are technocratic and who understand it, and we achieve a shared society in that way. However, there have long been very complicated reasons why lots of that may not work as effectively as it might, and one of the key areas is around, let's call it international regulation. Although it's very easy for us to make equality happen, well, very easy. We can make equality happen within our own countries by electing a pro-equality government who then puts this stuff in place. However, if we're looking at it in a global sense, it's much harder to kind of choose these policy choices. And this is one of the key areas where consumer movements acting together have been able to do it. And I'm going to kind of jump around on the paper that I've got here a little bit. I'm just going to start by just introducing the two examples that I put there. One was the South Africa boycott campaign, and one was the fair trade movement. And this is partly because I want to ground it in things that you will recognise. And in a way, they're two sides of the same coin. What we had the fellow from South Africa, Jan, described apartheid South Africa as the antithesis of a shared society, I think, yesterday. And indeed, civil society around the world spotted that as well. And there was a huge movement, a huge boycott movement of companies operating there, of financial institutions backing it. We're all part of a complex civil society movement that was part of the aggregate pressure for change that occurred there, and very famously so. But it's an interesting example because it gives the picture of the kind of alliances that these civil society organisations have to have impact. And they did have trade unions, and they did have church groups, and they did have political parties, and they did have consumer organisations, human rights groups, women's organisations, whole network of civil society organisations were part of creating sufficient market pressure in order for the effects to take place. And certainly there's been lots of study around South Africa boycott campaigns, and we know that it wasn't just polite argument. We know that the companies operating there had significant financial impacts from those campaigns, and that's why they left. Not because they accepted the arguments, it's because it was cheaper for them to leave and have a working business model elsewhere. So those are two. So that's one key example which everyone will be familiar with. Another one is the fair trade movement, and again, the idea that the fair trade movement is capable of doing some of the stuff that shared societies have. It is not new, and I was reading this book last night, and there's an example of a fair trade project in Swaziland in there. So we already know that the fair trade movement itself has got a good track record of looking at marginalised communities, going, how can we make stuff work for you? Let's create a market, especially around what you guys can do. However, the fair trade movement, particularly in Europe, has gone from identifying these small niche areas where they can have impact to a very, very significant market force now. We were doing some research into bananas in the last couple of months. We know fair trade bananas now take 36% of the UK market and 52% of the market in Switzerland. So they're becoming the dominant product here. They're no longer a marginal product supporting little marginal communities. They're becoming the dominant way that commodities are being supplied, certainly into Europe at this time. And this is the point at which I hope I'm going to be clicking on the right one. This is the little table that I put up on the I don't know if you can see the figures on that, but I put up on the it's on the second page of the report. But this is a project that's looked at, if you like, consumer behaviours in markets, which include boycotts and boycotts, is what they call it. Boycott is a terrible word that they've chosen to use, like buying fair trade products, but it's buying good things positively, the opposite of a boycott. And they're the third and fourth lines on there, and they've situated those as a broad within all other political activities. And it's an entertaining table in some way, because you can compare the differences between countries where there appears to be much less of this activity going on, to ones where there are, and perhaps expectedly Norway, Sweden, Finland, with famously developed social models, have much more of this kind of activity in this particular survey. This survey is actually, the data's from 2002, and every evidence is that there's been an increase across the board of this kind of activity. And it's interesting the way that it plugs into your discussion about political participation, because this is where they have, there's evidence of falling political participation in mature democracies as people become disillusioned with the choices between one neoliberal party and another. Effectively is pretty much what it boils down to, and we're able to see, as I think party member is joining political parties is now the second lowest here of all political participations, and we can see as the trend declines of political participation in electoral politics, there's a growth in this boycott and boycott behaviour, and we can also see that the boycott and boycott behaviours are more likely to be women, and they're more likely to be younger people. So they're people who've not always been a part of the normal political discourse. So that's just a little picture that situates it in other political activity. And so what's happened is that we've been able to look at things like South Africa, and we've been able to look at fair trade. And so we've been able to conceptualise this very broad thing that we call, at our organisation, we call ethical consumer behaviour. And we put it all into a basket and then try and understand it and look and see where else it might take place and what other forms it might do. And I think there are 3 points that I'm going to make rather than the 4 that I've written down. The first one is that companies and their brands are key pressure points for this type of political action. And so what's happening is that rather than go to governments and say this is the outcome we want more justice, we want more this, that and the other, people are taking their demands directly to companies because they believe that they can have some leverage. And these are for both positive and negative reasons. We know that the shared societies of the future that we all dream of in Club de Madrid, you know, are going to have some private companies in there. No one's suggesting that that's not going to be the case. However, there are some companies that I would welcome in the shared societies of the future, and the others that I'm not so certain that I actually want there. And the key point is, I think people are beginning to you know, there's been a traditional view of companies, which either you're Marxist and you think all companies are terrible and you've got to throw them in the bin, or you're capitalist and you think all companies are fantastic and how can you possibly criticise them? And I think people are becoming more, developing a more sophisticated analysis than either of that, and they're able to spot how companies can genuinely be useful contributors to society, and those that can actually be very destructive, and you know, at risk of putting you in libel problems. Perhaps we won't go into too much detail about which would be in which side. However, so the key element here is that we can make distinctions between more socially responsible and less socially responsible companies that are meaningful. And I think the key, you know, in lots of markets that's not possible. In lots of markets that's very possible. You know, for example, you know, car manufacturers, there's whatever, 10 big companies worldwide. It's very hard for small ethical entrepreneurs to set up a car manufacturing company. You know, however, in clothing, there are lots of people doing, you know, doing alternative clothing supply models. So there's a huge variety of different things here. And also, you know, when I buy clothing, I can choose to buy from, you know, Gap, a big international brand, or I can choose to buy from someone locally who's made it, you know, in their sewing machine in the back room. So there's a very huge difference between lots of the choices that are available. And where there's lots of choice in markets, that's where consumers acting in this way can have a big impact. So the first thing, companies are key pressure points. In competitive markets, whether there's a difference, there's lots of evidence that change is being driven very effectively using these approaches. The second one is there are lots of different ways of classifying these types of behaviour. Academics have done it, and we have, I put in this list here that we as sociologists, we can look around the world and go, look at all the different types of campaigns around that are trying to achieve social justice aims, and we have, you know, some of them we call human rights campaigns, and they're focused on rights. Other ones are labour rights campaigns, looking at trying to look at people who are in work and, you know, do they have freedom of association, do they have living wage, and there are lots of campaigns. There's a big network in Europe called Clean Clothes Campaign that collaborates internationally on driving change in the clothing sector. Health rights is another one that we've put here. There are lots of campaigns around particularly junk food, tobacco, this kind of stuff that NGOs do, sometimes taking the campaigns to the market, very famously with people like McDonald's. So there's lots of different categorisations, sub-categorisations. We haven't really got time to go into that here. One key point to make is that what I've put here is multi-stakeholder initiatives are becoming the preferred format for progress. And a good example of a multi-stakeholder initiative is FSC, Forest Stewardship Council. And what it is, it involves forest companies, it involves campaigners, it involves human rights NGOs, it involves workers, it involves governments, a whole range of people sit round the table. They go, what is a sustainable and fair standard for producing forest timber products? We're now going to create a label that we stick on what we think are fairly produced or, you know, sustainable products, the FSC label in this case, and we're going to have a monitoring and verification system of auditors who actually go out to forests and either pass or fail the supply chains. And certainly FSC is a fantastic example. It's quite successful. There's general agreement around it. I think when I last looked, which was a couple of years ago, around 40% of timber in the UK was FSC certified. The logs each have an individual stamp on them that you can track with your phones and all this kind of, you scan it with the codes, and you can work out exactly which bit of forest it comes from. So the chain of custody, fantastic. Good auditing systems. I mean, there are problems. They find evidence of corruption and they fail and all this kind of, but by and large, it's a hugely successful model. Called a multi-stakeholder initiative. There are lots of other ones. I put another example in there. Round Table on Sustainable Palm Oil is another one, RSPO. Much less successful, riven with conflict. Lots of NGOs have left it because they're not speaking to them anymore, and they think that it's certifying, armed gangs stealing land in Indonesia and all this kind of stuff. So, but there are lots and lots of multi-stakeholder initiatives. It's where lots of politics is going on now, and it's quite if you're stuck in the policy world, you can almost fail to notice all this stuff. There's masses and masses of political argument, debate, detailed work going on about how you actually get this verified product there, make it true and make it correct, and of course also the demands of trying to get market share for them. Okay, so. How 5 minutes?
No, well, 2 or 3 minutes.
Okay. We have policy implications. Although I say it exists in a sort of parallel universe and policy people don't need to worry about it, and somehow often it's a response to policy failure and this kind of stuff. However, there's a kind of, it is possible for policy makers to identify these sort of civil society behaviours and go, actually, we think they're quite good. We think they're quite useful as a way of regulating externalities, doing all sorts of complex things around product supply chains that are causing damage. And there are 5 areas that we have identified where policymakers can intervene around these kind of behaviours. And very briefly, the first one is government purchasing. We know that some of the FSC timber sales in the UK are because now the government's own bodies are mandated to only buy FSC timber. So that we know that government procurement can do this. We know that government procurement can also do stuff around employment. It can do pretty much, there's lots of power in procurement. Rather than mandating change through regulation, you can use procurement as a fantastic tool. Also, the research that you do for procurement supply chains, you publish, you put in the public domain, and then consumers and civil society groups can also use that. Second one is information. You can force companies to disclose the nature of the manufacture of their products, where their supply chains are, how they're, who they use, what the ingredients are, all these kind of things. And some of that, it happens around the food industry a little bit. We'd like to see it across pretty much the entire product range, so that civil society can engage in actually critically evaluating this stuff and making sure that what we're buying going forward is positive, has a positive impact. Tax, pretty obvious. You can have fiscal incentives for not-for-profit companies or fair trade companies, blindingly obvious. Regulation is another one. You can actually, interestingly around timber, not only do we have FSC, but we also in Europe, we've just had a ban on illegally logged timber. Strange that you'd need a ban on illegally logged timber. Anyway, there's now a ban on import of illegally logged timber in Europe as from last year. So often this stuff works in parallel with regulation. Finally, controlling corporate power. There are big issues around that. We've talked a little bit about that, and there are lots of ideas about how you can, amend company law to take to take the interests of other stakeholders into effect and all that kind of stuff. So, I'll finish off just by saying that to try and link it with some of the things that you were talking about, which is what we have here is an innovative economy, if you like, of citizen groups, human rights organisations innovating away, and every day there are new campaigns popping up. Just as I left to come here, we were contacted by an NGO working with fishermen in strangely enough, Honduras, and they discovered that a big company that had been forcing people off their land to put prawn farms around the edge of mangroves had been exporting these prawns to a high-profile British supermarket, and they contacted us and asked if they wanted, if they wanted us to become, whether we could help them around this campaign. And just as I left, we were beginning to talk to the supermarket about it, and it's because we can phone up the CSR guys, and it's very possible that by the time I get back, we'll have had a conversation with the supermarket. They'll have withdrawn this supply chain because they don't want to go into the area of all this boycott and this stuff. So a lot of this citizen activity you never actually see, because you can have a discourse with the companies and they don't want these battles in the public domain. They don't want their supply chains to be shown to be hugely problematic. So I'm kind of hoping that we go back and we realise and find that the Honduran prawn stuff will be resolved. May not be, of course, and there may be a big campaign next year on Honduran prawns. But that's just like one example, if you like, of how this that kind of innovation and that change can happen all the time. I'm just wondering if I've got time to finish on this little picture, whether it's going to go to the right place for me. Oh no, hang on. Oh, I remember where it is. Just in relation to the banks. Oh, here we go. We were talking about a banking campaign, and I know we've been talking about indexes and all this kind of stuff. And I thought it would amuse you. One of the things that we do is we do indexes of corporate ethical behaviour, and this is a score out of 20 that we give companies for their ethical behaviour. And I'd just sort of like to show you that we have kind of Barclays down at the bottom, Citibank score 2 out of 20. ING, famous Dutch bank there, it's not doing very well on 5.5. We go all the way up to Charity Bank. And one of the things that we're involved in is a Move Your Money campaign, which is addressing the very issues that you suggested. We don't like the too big to fail model. We want consumers to move their money out of too big to fail banks or banks with problematic behaviour issues, and into some of the ones at the top, which Ecology Building Society, Charity Bank, Triodos, a completely a kind of parallel economy of well-behaved banking institutions exist up there. And just to finish on, I'm just going to kind of show you the level of detail. I think is this going to work if I click on ING? Is that loading? I don't know. Yeah, it is. It's if I maybe busk for a minute or take some questions while it loads.
Just thinking, you said that ING was a bad example from the Netherlands. Triodos is a Netherlands bank.
It is, and it's a fantastic example. And so what we've, I can take some questions while we just show some of the. If we've got any questions.